Every revolver ever built leaks. Not the cheap ones, not the worn-out ones. All of them. Look at the front of a cylinder sometime. There's a gap between the cylinder face and the back of the barrel. 1/10 of a millimeter, maybe 2. It has to be there, because the cylinder has to turn. And the moment you pull the trigger, that gap stops being a tolerance and becomes an exhaust port. Burning gas at thousands of atmospheres finds it before the bullet has even left the case, and vents sideways in a flat white sheet you can photograph in a dark room. That's why you have never seen a suppressed revolver work. You can thread the barrel. You can bolt on the biggest can made. It doesn't matter, because the noise isn't coming out of the muzzle. It's coming out of the middle of the gun, behind the silencer, where nothing can reach it. It was never an engineering problem waiting for a clever fix. It's the shape of the machine. One production revolver in history closed that gap. Exactly one. Its cylinder slid forward before every single shot and pressed itself against the barrel like a hatch sealing shut. And the army that ordered it had no interest in silence at all. To understand why they built it anyway, start 4 years earlier with a rifle. In 1891, the Russian Empire adopted the 3-line rifle, the weapon we now call the Mosin. 3 lines of the old imperial measure came out to 7.62 millimeters, and that decision did something quietly enormous. It set a number. Gauges, reamers, rifling cutters, barrel blanks, inspection tooling, et more. From that year forward, the Empire's entire capacity for making holes in steel was calibrated to 1 diameter. Meanwhile, the handgun in an officer's holster was a relic. The Smith & Wesson No. 3 Russian .44 caliber, adopted back in 1871. Break action. Crack it open and all 6 cases eject at once, which made it one of the fastest reloading revolvers of its era. It was also enormous, heavy, and built entirely around black powder, a solution to a war that had already been fought. So a commission convened to replace it. And what they wrote down is where the story stops making sense. They wanted a solid frame, no hinge, no top latch, nothing that could stretch or work loose. A single closed block of steel with a bored hole through it. They wanted 7.62 millimeters because the tooling was already paid for. They wanted it to keep working when it was filthy, because it would be. They wanted it under 2 pounds. And then they specified the reload, not simultaneous ejection. A hinged loading gate on the right side of the frame, 1 chamber at a time, cases punched out individually with a rod. Slower than the revolver they were replacing. Slower than almost anything on the market. That wasn't an oversight. It was the point. The prevailing view among Russian ordnance officers was that a man who could dump 6 empties and refill in 4 seconds would treat his ammunition as though it were infinite. And in a country where resupply meant a horse cart on a dirt road, ammunition was not infinite. Make reloading deliberate, and you make the shooter deliberate. Awkwardness was written into the requirement as a virtue. Then came the last item on the list, and it broke everything above it. They wanted velocity, real velocity, out of a barrel 4.5 inches long, using the new smokeless powder, because the round had to punch through a winter greatcoat, through equipment, through a cavalry horse if it came to that. And this is the trap. A short barrel is already a bad deal for velocity. Now add the gap. Every shot, a fraction of your gas escapes at the exact moment it's doing the most work. You're taxed at the muzzle and taxed again behind it. Ask for a light revolver, a short barrel, a small diameter bullet and high velocity all at once, and the arithmetic simply refuses. Unless you stop the leak. The idea already existed. In 1886, a Belgian gunmaker named Henry Pieper had patented a revolver whose cylinder moved forward to meet the barrel and seal the joint. Clever, complicated, and commercially almost invisible. A solution in search of a customer, sitting in a patent file in Liège, which happens to be the same city as two brothers named Nagant. Léon and Émile Nagant were already inside the Russian file. Léon's work had fed directly into the rifle trials that produced the Mosin, and the Russian state had paid him 200,000 rubles for the contribution, an extraordinary sum, and more importantly, a receipt. So when the Nagants came back to St. Petersburg with a revolver, they weren't strangers pitching a design. They were suppliers with a track record, holding the one mechanism on Earth that answered a spec sheet nobody else could satisfy. The Empire bought it, and then did something shrewder. The contract sent the first production run, roughly 20,000 revolvers de Biche to Liège, and then handed the drawings, the gauges, and the manufacturing rights to Tula. Russia wasn't purchasing a revolver. It was purchasing the ability to make that revolver forever without ever asking Belgium again. So read the requirement list one more time, in order, and listen to what it's actually asking for. Build us a revolver that seals itself shut every time the hammer falls. Nobody had ever put a mechanism like that into mass production. In 1895, the Russian army did. And in doing it, they created something the Commission never asked for, never tested for, and would not have understood if you'd explained it to them. Hand someone a 7.62 by 38R cartridge and they'll assume it's broken. There's no bullet on it. The brass runs the full length of the round, then tapers down to a narrow mouth with a small hole in the middle and nothing sticking out. The bullet is in there. It's just buried, sunk below the mouth of the case, hiding behind a thin ring of brass that projects out past the nose like the neck of a bottle. Every other pistol cartridge on Earth does the opposite. The case grips the bullet at the base, and the bullet stands proud, exposed, ready to be pushed. This one swallowed it. That ring of brass is the entire invention. Here's the cycle. You pull the trigger. A pawl inside the frame catches the ratchet on the back of the cylinder and rotates a fresh chamber into line with the barrel. That part is ordinary, every revolver does it. Then the Nagant does something no other production revolver does. A cam drives the whole cylinder forward along its own axis, and the rear end of the barrel, machined down slightly like a spigot, slides into a counterbore cut into the chamber mouth. Metal into metal. The gap doesn't get smaller, it stops existing. And that protruding brass neck goes with it, sliding forward into the bore itself. So the case is now physically inside the barrel, is about to fire through. Then the hammer falls. The powder ignites. Pressure goes everywhere at once. And the thinnest, softest, least supported thing in the entire assembly is that brass neck sitting in the barrel throat. So it does what thin brass under pressure always does. It expands outward, hard, into the barrel wall and locks. The seal isn't made by the machining. The machining only puts the parts in position. The seal is made by the shot itself, in the first fraction of a millisecond, using the gas as its own gasket. The bullet leaves. Nothing else does. Now, what did all of that buy? 7 grams of lead at about 272 meters per second. Around 260 joules at the muzzle. Respectable for 1895. Unremarkable now. And roughly what a decent .32 does. And the gain from the gas seal, measured against the same round fired in a conventional revolver, was somewhere between 15 and 25 meters per second. 7%, give or take. Sit with that. The most mechanically complicated revolver ever mass-produced, an entirely new class of cartridge, a cylinder that has to move in 2 directions instead of 1, all of it engineered to recover 7%, which is not a scandal. It's what a great deal of good engineering actually looks like from the inside. Somebody writes an impossible line on a spec sheet, and somebody else builds an expensive, elaborate machine to win back a margin nobody outside the room will ever notice. If that's the kind of thing you'd rather watch than another highlight reel of guns going off, subscribe. We take apart the mechanism, not the mythology. And this particular mechanism has 3 surprises left in it, one of which changed who carried this revolver and why. Because the seal wasn't the only thing that Skinny Cartridge paid for. Drop the case diameter far enough and geometry gives you a gift. The Nagant fits 7 chambers into a cylinder that would otherwise hold 6. An extra round in the same envelope at the same weight for free. To this day, walk into a room of collectors and the 7-shot cylinder is how people recognize the gun before they read a single marking. Then comes the bill. Your trigger finger on one pull has to rotate the cylinder, shove that entire loaded cylinder forward against spring pressure and friction, and cock the hammer. 3 jobs, 1 finger, no assistance. Measured double action, a Nagant trigger typically lands somewhere between 9 and 12 kilograms, 20 to 26 pounds. That is heavy enough that the average shooter's whole hand clenches, the muzzle dips, and the shot goes low left before the hammer has finished falling. The Russian answer was to split the gun in 2. Officers received the double-action version on the reasoning that officers were trained enough to use it. Enlisted men received a single-action variant with no double-action capability at all. The hammer thumbed back for every shot, one at a time, deliberately. Cheaper to make, and it removed a temptation. That version stayed in production until roughly 1918, which means for 2 decades the Imperial Army fielded a modern sealed breech revolver and told most of the men holding it to operate it like a cowboy gun. The factory paid too. A conventional revolver tolerates slop. That's what the gap is for. A Nagant tolerates almost none. The chamber mouths must be counterbored to match the barrel spigot, all 7 of them, concentric enough that steel enters steel 7 times out of 7 without binding. The cam timing has to be exact. The cylinder has to slide freely and still lock up tight, in a weapon guaranteed to be full of grit and fouling. And every seal in the world shares one weakness: it degrades. As a Nagant wears, the fit opens up and the gun slowly turns back into an ordinary leaking revolver, only heavier. Add up that ledger, a punishing trigger, machining no other revolver requires, and precision that decays with every round fired and the honest verdict is that Russia bought a very clever answer to a question that wasn't worth asking. Except there was one line nobody wrote down. The Nagant's bullet left the barrel at 272 meters per second. The speed of sound is 343. That bullet could not break the sound barrier if you begged it. No crack, no shock wave, nothing but the muzzle blast behind it. And the muzzle blast was the only sound the gun made anywhere, because the gap was sealed. 2 conditions: subsonic ammunition and 0 gas escaping from the middle of the weapon. Together, they describe the only revolver on the planet that could ever be made quiet. In 1895, that was worth exactly nothing to anybody. The men who would need it hadn't been recruited yet, and the organization that would issue them wouldn't exist for another 22 years. Manchuria, winter of 1905. Frozen mud, thawed mud, dust that gets into everything, and a Russian army losing a war it expected to win in a season. This is where the spec sheet finally gets audited, not by a commission with a set of gauges, but by men who hadn't cleaned a weapon in 9 days. And on the parts nobody remembers arguing about, the design held up completely. The solid frame had nothing to spring open, nothing to stretch, no hinge to seize. The loading gate was a hinged flap and a rod, 2 moving pieces that could freeze solid and still be forced back into service with a thumb. Grit that would tie up a self-loader just got ground into paste and ignored. The revolver worked at Port Arthur, worked at Mukden, worked afterward, and it kept working for the next 40 years in conditions that were routinely worse. The complaints were all on the other page. Officers wanted more from the round. 7 grams at 270 meters per second does what it does. And against a man in winter layers at any real distance, does what it does was not a phrase anyone found comforting. And then there was the reloading, which in a firefight stopped being a philosophical position about ammunition discipline and became a physical fact. Open the gate, punch out a case with the rod, and after firing, those cases sat swollen tight in their chambers, expanded by the very seal that made the gun special. Turn the cylinder, punch out the next 7 times, then load 7 times. A trained man needs the better part of half a minute. The old Smith & Wesson they'd retired in 1895 broke open and dumped all 6 in one motion. Meanwhile, the rest of the world had moved. The Mauser C96 was a decade old. The Luger was in German holsters. Browning's pocket automatics were everywhere, and Colt had just given the Americans the 1911. Russian officers who could afford it quietly bought their own. A Browning in a coat pocket was a status object and a practical upgrade at the same time. The Nagant was fine. Fine was no longer where the world was. Then came 1914, and demand went vertical. Tula built revolvers as fast as Tula could build revolvers, and it was not close to enough. Going back to the original source wasn't an option either. Liège, where the whole thing had been designed, was under German occupation by the end of August. So the Empire did the thing no ordnance department ever wants to put on paper. It went shopping abroad for handguns. Among those purchases came an order to Colt in Hartford, usually cited at around 50,000 M1911 pistols in .45. Read that as a sentence about the Nagant, and it's damning. 20 years after adopting a revolver specifically so it could be manufactured at home forever, Russia was paying dollars for American self-loaders because its own factory could not produce enough of its own gun. And then the empire that ordered it stopped existing, and the revolver's status inverted. Through the Revolution and the Civil War, the Nagant became less a model of firearm and more a piece of vocabulary. In Russian, Nagant stopped meaning this particular Belgian design and started meaning revolver, any revolver, the way Kalash would later swallow an entire category. It's in the memoirs, it's in the songs, it's in the courtroom transcripts. When someone in 1919 said the word, nobody asked which one. The Soviet state then did something to the object itself. Between 1919 and the early 1920s, it created the honorary revolutionary weapon, and for fewer than 24 men in the entire country, that meant a Nagant M1895 with the badge of the Order of the Red Banner mounted directly into the wooden grip. Not a plaque, not a case, not a certificate. Metal screwed into the handle of a working revolver, so the decoration and the weapon could not be separated. You carried your citation on your hip, loaded, which is a remarkable status for a gun that by every technical measure had already lost. So here's the ledger by 1926 stated plainly. The trigger was punishing. The cartridge was weak by the standards of every serious military pistol then in service. Reloading was slower than the weapon it replaced 30 years earlier. It cost more to machine than a simple revolver because of the counterboard chambers and the cam timing that made the seal possible. And its one clever trick returned a margin the average soldier could not feel. Every honest report said the same thing. The Red Army kept it anyway, for a reason that has nothing to do with ballistics. The reason was Tula. 2.5 decades of fixtures, jigs, gauges, cutters, inspection standards, and trained hands, all built around this one design and its one hard requirement: 7 chambers that accept a barrel spigot without binding. Replacing the revolver didn't mean approving a drawing. It meant re-equipping the plant, retraining the workforce, and standing down the only high-volume handgun line the country had, in a decade when the country had no spare capacity for anything. The gun survived because the gun was cheaper to keep than to stop making. That's it. That's the whole mechanism of its immortality. So they kept making it. Tula for decades, Ijevsk during the Second World War, north of 2 million produced in total, the last of them coming off the line in 1945, 50 years after adoption, into a world of submachine guns and self-loading rifles. The formal end did arrive, though, and it arrived on schedule. In 1930, the Red Army adopted the TT, a Browning-patterned self-loader, 8 rounds in a detachable magazine, a bottlenecked cartridge doing well over 400 meters per second, and a reload that took as long as it took to drop one box and push in another. Against that, the M1895 wasn't a compromise anymore. It was a museum piece with a serial number still in the active inventory. Being declared obsolete should have been the end of it. Instead, 1930 turns out to be roughly the year the Nagant started earning the reputation it actually has today, the one it's still remembered for 90 years later, in a country where almost nobody has fired one. And none of that reputation was earned on a battlefield. The most sinister accessory in the Soviet arsenal was named after 2 brothers, and the name is almost comically bureaucratic: Ivan and Vasily Mitin. Take the Russian word for brothers, take the surname, staple them together, and you get Bramit. It sounds like a fertilizer plant. It was a suppressor, and by the early 1940s it was in service. The version for the Mosin rifle in larger numbers, and the version that matters here, the one that screwed onto the muzzle of a 45-year-old revolver. The principle was simple in outline. The bullet passes through soft rubber obturating elements that briefly hold the gas behind it, so pressure bleeds off gradually instead of arriving all at once as a bang. Cheap, small, effective, and consumable, the rubber wore out and got replaced. Bolt that same idea onto any other revolver on Earth and it accomplishes nothing, because the gas doesn't care what's on the muzzle when there's an open gap in the middle of the gun. Only one revolver in the world had no gap and no supersonic bullet, and that combination had been sitting in its technical description unused for 45 years. What came out of it was the first suppressed handgun anywhere to be issued as standard equipment. Not Hollywood quiet, but quiet enough that at 30 or 40 meters in woodland at night, a man could be shot and the sound would not tell anyone which direction it came from, or that it was a gunshot at all. The people who received them were reconnaissance troops and partisans, and for that work the value was obvious. A scouting party's entire mission was to enter, learn something, and leave without the enemy knowing anyone had been there. A conventional pistol shot ends that mission the moment it's fired. This one didn't necessarily end anything. It made a flat, dull, unremarkable noise in a forest already full of noises. For 4 decades, the Nagant's one clever feature had been a rounding error on a ballistics table. In the swamps and pine forests of the Eastern Front, it became the entire reason the weapon still existed. But the Bramit was not the first time someone in the Soviet Union looked at this revolver and saw an instrument rather than a service arm. Through the 1930s, the Nagant M1895 was the standard weapon used by the NKVD to carry out death sentences during the Terror at a scale that ran into the hundreds of thousands. That is not folklore, and it isn't an accident of what happened to be in the storeroom. The choice tracked the mechanism, and the reasons are all engineering ones. A revolver ejects nothing while it operates, so nothing is thrown, scattered, or has to be collected afterward. It has no slide and no magazine, so there is no cycle to fail. The sequence advances only when the operator moves his finger, at whatever pace he sets, indefinitely, without a malfunction being possible, in the way a self-loader can malfunction. The cartridge was low-powered, which at contact distance was not a defect. And because the gap was sealed, This was the one revolver in existence that did not push a jet of hot gas across the hand holding it. Every one of those properties had been engineered to answer a different question than the one it was now answering. The design was optimized for reliability under filth, indifference to careless handling, and total manual control. Those three virtues transferred exactly and horribly to work that had nothing to do with war. And this is where the story turns, because the Nagant failed at it. The one demand nobody had ever placed on the design was volume. Not 7 shots, not a cylinder, not a firefight. Hundreds of rounds in a single session, day after day. Under that load, the revolver's weaknesses stopped being paperwork and became physical. Recoil that is tolerable across a magazine's worth is punishing across hundreds of repetitions, transmitted straight into the wrist by a heavy steel frame. The steel heats, and the trigger demands a full clenching effort of the hand every single time, and never gets lighter. The evidence comes from the people doing it. Vasily Blokhin, the NKVD's chief executioner, did not use the standard issue revolver at Cotton in 1940. He brought his own equipment, a case of German Walther pocket pistols and 7.65mm B, specifically because Soviet revolvers punished the hand over long periods, and he had calculated that his hands had to keep working. Read that as a technical assessment, and it is close to the most damning verdict ever passed on a firearm. The man whose entire function depended on this weapon, in the role for which it is now most notorious, judged it unfit for purpose and privately replaced it with a small German automatic. The association stuck to the object anyway, and permanently. In Russian, the word had already swallowed the whole category of revolvers. After the 30s, it swallowed the decade as well. You cannot use it neutrally, and no Russian speaker hears it neutrally. A cam surface and a counterboard chamber, patented in Liège in 1886 to recover a few percent of muzzle velocity, ended up as a historical marker for one of the worst decades of the 20th century. Which leaves one question, and it's the one nobody has a comfortable answer to. The gas seal worked. It did exactly what it was designed to do for half a century in the hands of 2 armies and 1 secret police, and it handed the world its only suppressible revolver as a side effect. Every serious maker since has built revolvers: Colt, Smith & Wesson, Ruger, Maneurin, Astra, and every state arsenal in Europe. Not one of them ever put a gas seal revolver into production again. Not because the idea was wrong. Here's the proof, and it comes from the Nagant brothers themselves. In 1887, Sweden adopted a Nagant revolver. In 1893, Norway adopted a Nagant revolver. Same family, same workshop in Liège, same decade, both in 7.5mm, both solid frame service arms that stayed in holsters for years. Neither one had a gas seal. Same designers, same drawing office. And when the customer was Stockholm or Oslo, the brothers built a normal revolver with a normal gap, because Stockholm and Oslo had asked for a normal revolver. The seal was never a philosophy. It was a compliance measure, one requirement from one commission in one country, written in a way that could not be satisfied any other way. Delete that line from the spec and the mechanism evaporates. It never appeared again because nobody ever wrote that line again. That didn't stop anyone from stretching the platform in every other direction. There was a carbine, a Nagant with a long barrel, a far end, and a shoulder stock, built in small numbers for guards and border work. A 7-shot rifle with a 26-pound trigger, which tells you how much faith the arsenal had in the frame and how little it had in ergonomics. At the opposite end, in the late 1920s, came a shortened version with a barrel of roughly 85mm and a cut-down grip, made in limited quantity for men in civilian coats who needed the gun not to show. And it was licensed out. Poland built its own at Radom through the 1930s, the NG-30, in the low tens of thousands. A Polish factory manufacturing a Belgian design to a Russian pattern, which is a fairly complete summary of interwar Central Europe. Then the strangest afterlife of all. The Nagant became a sporting gun. Soviet target shooting ran on this frame for decades. Service revolvers were converted to 5.6mm rimfire for cheap training, and Tula went further, building purpose-made target revolvers on the same architecture, the TOZ-36, later the TOZ-49. Refined triggers, adjustable sights, competition guns whose outline traces straight back to 1895. And they had no gas seal. Of course they didn't. The moment the requirement became putting holes in paper at 25 meters, Tula's own engineers dropped the one feature that made the gun famous and kept everything else. Even the factory that had spent half a century building sealed revolvers only built them sealed because it had been told to. Meanwhile, the original kept working. After 1945, the M1895 rotated out of the Army and into everything the Army didn't do. Paramilitary guard units, forestry and railway security, warehouse and bank guards, cash-in-transit crews. Nothing about it was modern. Everything about it was adequate, paid for, and already in the vault. By various accounts, Nagants were still being drawn from Russian guard armories in the 2000s, a design adopted the same year the Lumiere brothers held their first public film screening, still on inventory alongside mobile phones. Then the surplus wave hit America. Nagants arrived by the crate, and for a while you could buy one for around $100. For a lot of shooters, the cheapest possible way into a 100-year-old military revolver in working condition. And then they ran into the ammunition, which is where the whole story closes its loop. 7.62 by 38R has never been a common cartridge, and factory runs come and go. So shooters went looking for substitutes and discovered that certain .32 class cartridges will physically chamber and fire in many Nagants. It works, roughly. It also destroys the entire point of the gun. Those cases have no long neck projecting into the barrel, so there's nothing to expand and nothing to seal. And the gas escapes exactly the way it does in every other revolver ever made. Feed a Nagant the wrong ammunition, and you don't get a slightly worse Nagant. You get an ordinary leaking revolver with a terrible trigger, because the seal was never a part of the gun. The seal was a partnership between the gun and one specific cartridge, and it only exists when both are present. Which brings us to the verdict, and to the way the world actually solved the problem the Nagant solved by accident. The goal, a handgun that fires without announcing itself, did get achieved properly twice. In Vietnam, the Americans built the quiet special-purpose revolver for tunnel work, a revolver firing a cartridge that trapped its own gas inside the case, behind a captive piston, so almost nothing reached the barrel at all. Decades later, in Russia, Igor Stekhin's OTS-38 did the same thing with the SP-4 round, a 5-shot revolver where the silence lives in the ammunition instead of the frame. Look at what that means. Both designs took the Nagant's problem and moved it. The Nagant sealed the mechanism and paid for it with a cam, a sliding cylinder, 7 counterbore chambers, and a factory built around tolerances no other revolver needs. The later answers sealed the cartridge, and once you can do that, the revolver holding it is free to be completely ordinary. The elegant solution didn't beat the Nagant's approach. It made the Nagant's approach unnecessary, permanently. A dead end isn't a failure. It's a path somebody walked all the way to the end, until someone else found a shorter one. This channel runs on exactly that, the branches that worked and still went nowhere, because the whole idea of them got solved somewhere else. Subscribe if you want more of them. And if there's a mechanism you've always suspected was cleverer than its reputation, put it in the comments, because that's usually where the next one of these starts. 2 million Nagants, 50 years of production, 3 states, 1 secret police, a sporting career, a suppressor nobody planned for, and 108 years from a czar's commission to a bank guard's holster. Every other revolver in history let its gunshot escape sideways and never thought twice about it. One design refused, closed itself with a ring of brass, and paid for that refusal in every way a machine can be made to pay. And it's the only one still worth explaining.